afternoon, and thank you all for joining the Working Group 1 meeting for the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative, which focuses on the supply commitment and resource efficiency evaluation topics. I'm Christina Osborne, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs Group. I'll be providing support for the meeting. We have Mark Richardson as the facilitator and Bob Cott as the scribe for this working group, and then Phil Pettengill as the coordinator overseeing all three of the EDAM working groups. For today's agenda, Milos Basanik and George Angelides from ISO will start the discussions on confidence in EDAM transfers. Danny Johnson from the ISO's policy team is also on as a panelist. And we have Bobby Olson from SRP, who will review examples of transfer scenarios. And then at the end of the meeting, Bob Cott, who is the scribe for this working group, will provide a recap of the discussion, and Mark will go over the topics for the next meeting. And just a couple of meeting reminders. These working groups are intended to be collaborative, and we do encourage you to ask questions and share your perspectives. So please feel free to raise your hand at any time, and Mark will call on you when you're in the queue. And once your line is unmuted, please start by stating your name and affiliation. These meetings are recorded. We do post the video files out on the corresponding working group web pages, where you'll find the other related materials related to these meetings. And the recordings and any other related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you have any follow-up questions after the meeting, please submit them using the inquiry link located on the resources slide at the end of the presentation. You can also reach out to any of the facilitator or myself via email. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn the meeting over to Mark Richardson to review the meeting objectives.
Thank you, Christina. Can you confirm you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
All right. Good afternoon, team, and happy Wednesday. I appreciate everyone's time. This past Monday, just real quick, we definitely continued some of that discussion on RSC failure consequences. At a high level, I do not believe we as a group have reached a common ground or consensus on the particular frameworks proposed thus far. Those being applying a hurdle rate or an administrative penalty. However, I do believe the group is leaning towards financial consequences in the day-ahead time frame rather than physically limiting those transfers. Given we have 3 working group sessions left for today, as teed up on our last call, I wanted to shift our focus on an extremely critical element pertaining to the successful EDAM design, this element being the confidence of EDAM transfers. As Christina mentioned, we have Milos, Danny, and George from the ISO team to kind of help tee up that conversation and provide some background and context, as well as, Bobby, thank you in advance, Bobby Olson from SRP, has agreed to walk through some examples that his team put together to kind of help spur that conversation and get the group going. In the interest of time, Milos, I don't know if you wanted to hop in here, help get us started, frame up today's discussion, and then we'll take it from there. One thing I do want to note before Milos hops in is we did post the questions that Working Group 1 had committed to providing. That feedback is due by next week. So if you haven't done so already, please be sure to go take a look at those. We definitely look forward to those responses. With that, I'll hand it over to you, Milos.
Thank you, Mark, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. As Mark said, we are coming up on one of the more critical items in our EDAM discussions. I think ideally we would have gotten to this item a bit earlier in the working group discussions, but I think we had the opportunity to talk about a number of topics that are related to this discussion of confidence in EDAM transfers, and I think that context is really going to help us throughout the discussion today. We talked about RUC, we talked about certain elements of the resource sufficiency evaluation, certain elements of the market. So I think some of those discussions that we've had previously in this working group tee us up well to have this more robust discussions on really the confidence level in EDAM transfer. So let's go to the next slide, please. Just a little bit of background, again, to set the context for the discussion and really, I think, allow for collaborative dialogue today. I wanted to put the concept of confidence in EDAM transfers in a bit of a perspective. So as you all know, to the extension of the day-ahead market, those participating entities will be relying on transfers between EDAM balancing authority areas to serve load. And I think one of the critical things that we've been talking about both in Working Group 2 and in this working group is really the optimization benefits of those transfers and the need to ensure that there's reliability to these transfers, there's confidence in these transfers, because ultimately the day-ahead market may be decommitting units across those balancing authority areas in favor of committing others in other areas to serve load, and then to derive those mutual benefits. And so it's important to have that confidence in EDAM transfers, because these the day-ahead market will be decommitting units in favor of other units in other areas, and parties will be relying on these transfers to serve load. And so I think that high confidence in EDAM transfers really incentivizes that participation, maximizing both the efficiency and the benefits that are gained across the EDAM footprint. One of the common EDAM design principles that I think we covered early on was the concept, or the starting concept, that there should be high confidence in these EDAM transfers. And Bobby is going to walk us later today through some examples that I think he also walked that principle, that team of subset of EIM folks, as well as the PTOs that develop those common design principles. We'll walk through similar examples, and he's going to share those today and facilitate a discussion. But it all gets to that concept of what is the level of confidence in EDAM transfers. And I think a robust sufficiency test that we've been talking about, as well as the robust day-ahead market design. We've talked about the IFM role. We've talked about the role of RUC. I think those will also help ensure that load is served, and that some of this uncertainty is really addressed, and enabling really the firm energy transfers that parties can rely upon. Let's go to the next slide. Before we again get into it, I wanted to just tee up a few questions for parties to consider, for stakeholders to consider as we go throughout this discussion. As Bobby goes through the examples, again, there may be other things to consider here, but I think these are some of the critical elements to consider based on what we've heard throughout the discussion so far. But what's the level of confidence? I think one concept is, what's the level of confidence of a transfer that's clearing the day-ahead market, and that these transfers will continue to be supported under stress conditions? What's the level of confidence that an EDAM entity that's participating in the market has that these transfers will continue to be supported when we get into stress system conditions, into different emergency situations? And I think it's important to have that discussion. That will be teased out through some of the examples. I think some of the other things that we've heard throughout the discussion is really, what's the role of supply that's secured to serve native load, and how is that used in the concert, or how does that relate in concert with EDAM market transfers? I think we've heard the discussion about capacity that's secured to serve load, capacity that's secured under resource adequacy contracts, or different resource planning programs that entities may be under. That capacity is secured to serve load. But then once we get into stress system conditions, I think the important question is, what is that confidence in EDAM transfers, and how does that capacity relate to ensuring that EDAM transfers are reliable and dependable? So let's keep an eye on that aspect as well, in the context of resource adequacy capacity and capacity that's just procured under the different resource planning programs that parties may be participating under. But also, I think the other question I think I wanted to tee up and to consider through this discussion is, can we find common ground in the concept that EDAM transfers should be high confidence transfers? And if so, what's the interplay with the other components of the day-ahead market design to ensure that confidence in transfers? What role the different elements of the day-ahead market play in helping us ensure that there is that confidence in EDAM transfers? Like I said, there may be other things, there are going to be other things that spur discussion as we go through the examples a bit later today and through the discussion over the next couple of meetings. So keep those in mind, and we encourage you really to speak up and share your perspectives. I'm going to turn it over now to George to tee up also, some of the mechanics, and provide an overview of some of the mechanics that the market currently has in place. And as we've been talking about the day-ahead market design, some of those mechanics that could help us ensure that the optimization and that the market commitments can find that optimal solution, even in some of these stress system conditions. But I think it will be important to walk through some of these more kind kind of cornerstone scenarios and some of the more difficult scenarios that I think Bobby is prepared to walk us through today, because that raises some additional questions that I think we need to walk through. So really appreciate everybody's participation. I know this is going to be a very robust discussion. It's a very important topic, so I encourage your engagement. And I'll turn it over to you, George, and then after George, we'll jump into Bobby's examples.
Thank you, Milos. Good afternoon, everybody. This is George Angelidis with the ISO. So the question that has been raised and what we want to answer here in this session is what can go wrong in real time that the market, the way we design it here, cannot accommodate, and let's see the conditions around that question, how this can happen. So we start here with making some assumptions based on the extended day-ahead market design that we're talking about it for all these calls here. So we assume that we have a day-ahead market in place, that it has the IFM component that procures all the imbalance reserves that are needed to cover the 95th percentile of uncertainty, any uncertainty in either direction. We have in place the rack component that procures all the reliability capacity that is needed to cover for the difference between physical supply clearing the IFM and the demand forecast for its BAA. We have the must offer obligation for imbalance reserves and reliability capacity awards from the day-ahead market, that these awards need to be available in the Western energy imbalance market with bids, so they will be available after we procure them. And we also make the assumption that the BAAs that come prepared, both in EDAM and of course in EIM, they pass the EDAM RSC. They have sufficient capacity lined up and available in the market to meet all the reliability requirements for the BAA. And once this is in place, with all these assumptions that we have in place for EDAM, it is expected that they will also pass the energy imbalance market resource sufficiency evaluation. So if all this in place, what can go wrong in real time that the market cannot address? So let's go to the next slide.
George?
Yes.
Real quick, before we move on, I do see a hand up, Michelle Quito from the CPUC, if you don't mind.
Yeah, but I only talked about assumptions. So the next question is, I mean, maybe we can open the question after I go through this slide. I mean, this is what the question is going to be.
That works.
Right? So let me go through the slide, and then we have questions. So what can go wrong, right, between EDAM and EIM? So one thing that can happen is we could have outages, resource outages that could occur. And for that, we have contingency reserves that are procured or designated in the day-ahead market. And if with the assumption that the contingency reserves are meeting the requirements of NERC for the largest single contingency and the percentage for the demand forecast, then we expect that these contingency reserves will be available to be deployed to cover these outages. So this is not a concern. We have it covered. What other thing can happen? Regarding the difference between demand forecast and what supply was scheduled in the IFM, again, we have that covered with reliability capacity awards that are available in EIM to be dispatched to meet the demand forecast. So we are going now to the issue of uncertainty. We have covered the uncertainty within the 95th percentile. Okay, that's what we procured. That was our procurement target. So what can happen if the uncertainty materializes beyond this 95th percentile, right? There is still a probability that the uncertainty may materialize beyond the level of the procurement that we had in EDAM for imbalance reserves. And here we have the benefit in EIM, where actually we have procured also imbalance reserve in other BAAs that we can use transfers to serve uncertainty that may materialize in any BAA beyond the 95th percentile. So really the only gloomy scenario that we're looking at a perfect storm developing in real time is if the uncertainty materializes beyond the 95th percentile coincidentally in all EIM BAAs over the entire grid, which is a highly improbable scenario. But under that scenario, essentially everything that is available in EIM, all the reliability capacity that we had lined up from the day ahead, all imbalance reserves, all right, have been dispatched. We used all that, and potentially any new supply bids that they came in real time, they were not available, they were not participating in the day ahead, or they were not even used in the day ahead. We had some surplus and we didn't use them, and they're still available in real time. We used all of it. So all of it that was available, it was dispatched. All the transfers that are defined in the Western EIM, they're all optimized. So the market did all possible it could do. And now we're at the unfortunate but yet highly improbable scenario where we still have uncertainty that cannot be met with all the economic bids that we have already exhausted. At that point, the market will need to relax the power balance constraint to essentially signal, and we can see this ahead of time because the real-time market is a multi-interval optimization with a look ahead. So ahead of time, we will see that the real-time market will relax the power balance constraint, signaling that there is not sufficient capacity or flexibility for that particular interval in the future to meet the demand forecast with all the uncertainty that is materializing. And that will be a signal to operators that will prompt operator actions for emergency conditions. At that point, the market has done all it could do, and now we have to rely on actions outside of the market that operations have at their disposal to call on for emergency power, to put in additional resources that they were not even in the market, or any other action, perhaps interruptible demand programs, and this we can discuss about what needs to be in place or what is already in place today that operators can use for addressing these emergency conditions. So let's open to discussion on these items. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Let's go to Michelle first.
Hey, George, this is Michelle from the CPUC. So I've got a couple of circumstances and a couple of questions. So let's assume that California load is 40,000 and California resources are 40,000. Let's assume that there are 4,000 megawatts of intertie bids from non-EDAM entities. And then let's assume that there are 4,000 megawatts of transfers, EDAM transfers to another balancing authority based on the intertie bids that are put into the day-ahead market. But let's say those intertie bids don't show up. Is the CAISO now on, I mean, are we required to support those EDAM transfers that are based on intertie bids?
So first of all, Michelle, we do have policies and procedures in place that will penalize any intertie schedules that clear the day-ahead market, but they don't tag. But let's go beyond that. Let's say that no matter what penalties we have in place, this actually happens, and those intertie bids do not tag. So now we go into real time having a day-ahead export transfer of 4,000 megawatts, as you mentioned in your example, yet we don't have 4,000 imports to cover this. So what will happen is that EIM will redispatch and reoptimize these transfers and will essentially, if everything else is the same, like in the day ahead, except for those imports that are missing, you will see a counterflow um, transfer that will essentially nullify those export transfers that were scheduled in the day-ahead market.
But let's assume it's tight system conditions and those intertie bids. They bid into the day-ahead market, but they are, they are better. They decide that they want to get more money in the Northwest, so they are not there. I guess I'm trying to say, like, if nothing else happens and they don't show up, who has to drop load? Is it California or is it the EDAM exports?
Why are you assuming that someone has to drop load? Essentially, resources in the BAAs, in other BAAs, will be redispatched to counter that 4,000 day-ahead transfer economically, and no one will drop load.
Yeah, so I guess the thing is, I'm only concerned about stress system conditions, right? I mean, I get it, non-stress system conditions, everything will work out. But I'm trying to say when push comes to shove, who's responsible?
Yeah, and Michelle and George, I know you've seen some of Bobby's examples. I think it may be best, and Michelle, I think you're raising great points that absolutely as a group we need to hone in on. I think it would really help to kind of walk through Bobby's examples, and to the extent, Michelle, you bring up a few, stress system condition examples, maybe we add those in that conversation. But from, I would like to kind of walk through.
Okay, so let me just give one more example. So assuming that it's not an intertie bid, but it's an EDAM 4,000 megawatt transfer that allows a 4,000 megawatt transfer out of the CAISO system, but then assume that you have, due to a fire, a loss of the transmission line, so you don't have those 4,000 megawatts of transfers. The question is, like, who bears that responsibility, and ultimately who has to drop load under that circumstance as well? So that's my other one. And then my third issue is the 95 percentile. I thought I thought based on the data you guys showed that the 95th percentile really didn't cover most of the uncertainty during those stress system days. I mean, I'll go back, but I really felt like it sort of covered average uncertainty in the end when you guys showed the data.
Mark, do you want me to answer, or do you want to go to Bobby's to the examples in the next?
Yeah. So I think if you want to address the 95th percentile, George, that'd be great. But from the example standpoint, I would like to hold on those. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah. So the 95th percentile is what it says. Really, we evaluate the potential probabilistic uncertainty that could materialize, and we draw the line at the 95th percentile. We get a megawatt for that, and that sets the imbalance reserve requirements. That says that 5% of the time, the uncertainty may materialize outside that bracket. And if you have in mind that particular day where we had tight conditions, that you're saying we didn't have sufficient imbalance reserves to cover the uncertainty, then that probably is one of these 5% scenarios that the uncertainty materializes beyond the 95th percentile.
Right, but then what happens then? I mean, if it's stress system conditions and you've only procured to the 95th percentile.
It's what this says in the slide.
I understand, but if you're only... Okay, well, I'll go back and find exactly it for my next question. I'll go back and find it. But with regard to that, that means that 5% of the time, we're not going to be covering it. And those 5% of the times are going to be the stress system conditions, I assume.
Right, but that's not what the slide says, right? The slide says that even if the uncertainty in one BAA, let's say the ISO BAA here, for example, materializes beyond the 95th percentile, we don't expect, all right, with any high probability, that this will also happen to every other BAA in the IM. So there will be imbalance reserve awards in other BAAs that could be dispatched to bring transfers into the ISO to serve that uncertainty. The only scenario where you may have a problem for the markets to find an optimal solution, a feasible solution, is if this uncertainty beyond the 95th percentile materializes everywhere in the entire EIM footprint. Right? Then, of course, all our
Right.
capacity
Right. But
is
I
exhausted.
Yeah. Hey, Michelle.
Okay.
Michelle and George. So you're raising good points, Michelle, and we'll definitely get to this uncertainty percentile percentage here later on in the examples. And I do want to just recognize, I think this is a concern and/or, something that all EDAM BAAs need to consider, what level of confidence there is in this procurement. So let me go to Jeff Nelson, and then maybe by us walking through these examples, that'll kind of help frame the discussion. Go ahead, Jeff.
Good afternoon. Hopefully you can hear me, and I put my hand down. Okay, so my first question is, okay, you've got all these sort of backup products, and given that, there's going to be extra even if one person's wrong. But what if you can't buy them? What happens if day ahead you go out to buy your 95th percentile, it's just not there? Or you roll into ruck and it's just not there? What happens? Then I have one more question about ruck.
Yes, that's a good question, Jeff. That means that we have insufficient participation in the market. And I made the assumption in the previous slide that the BAAs come prepared and they pass the RSC test. If we have a BAA that doesn't pass the RSC test, that means they're unprepared. So, of course, everything unwinds now, right? The market can only procure when there are bids, when there is participation. If there is insufficient participation and you fail the RSC, meaning you didn't bring enough to the market cannot help you anymore. It will procure whatever it can, and then you'll go short. But it will tell you that you are short, so you have to start planning to make up the shortfall between day ahead and real time.
Okay, I think that's sort of a nuance here that we may be, technically there are no emergencies in the day ahead, right? There's only emergencies in the real time when the power is flowing. So day ahead is sort of your setup market, and the question becomes what happens if you're not able to properly set up, prepare when I say set up.
Yes.
Okay, so that's something we really need to consider. There's a lot of reasons I can see there being issues. I can even see people passing the RSC and still not being able to get enough of the sort of market because of the additional constraints that I understand. Again, I'm still a little confused on RSC. The constraints and the full sort of security constrained nature of the market relative to the RSC test.
Yes, that's possible, Jeff. We're doing whatever is, possible, but we're doing the best possible outcome for the RSC with the optimization model we proposed, but still, it's not 100% perfect, right? We cannot hit perfection because we left the transmission constraints out, and again, we don't want to run the full market before we run the market, but we are reasonably at the point that we're saying we have the best possible resource efficiency evaluation. There's still a minor probability that even if you pass the RSC based on this methodology, you may still not have enough, considering that maybe transmission constraints will prevent the procurement. But again, you have to see that the procurement takes place over the entire market footprint. So you still have the availability of the transfers that they can be fully optimized in IFM to cover that, right?
Yeah. Okay, so my next question has to do with how we do things, sort of, in theory, do things today in RUC, and sort of, maybe it's an open question. What sort of these concepts sort of flow over, right? Because today, if people are trying to, Michelle's sort of issue aside about sort of exports as well as imports coming and how we back those, but today, if people are just trying to take exports from California, they don't get to tag unless they've sort of gone through the RUC process and the ISO has determined it has sufficient excess capacity to support the transactions, or unless that person has designated a non-resource adequacy resource as the source of that transaction, then they're kind of firm. How does that concept of sort of priority exports, identifying whether you're backing your transaction with a non-RA resource versus an RA resource, how does that current practice fit into this framework?
So, as you said it, Jeff, for export self-schedules, we do distinguish those two different priorities. for non-array, that they support PT exports, and everything else is an LPT export, which has a lower priority than load. The transfers, the economic transfers, they're economic, like they're not even line up there. So they will only be scheduled if there is enough supply, considering that some of it is already consumed by those export self-schedules based on these two priorities. But as I mentioned here in my response to Michelle, having a day-ahead export transfer is not a locked commitment for the BAA. That transfer is available for reoptimization in real time. So you had extra supply in the day ahead and it was economic, all right? So the EDAM scheduled it as an export transfer to meet load outside, okay? In real time, let's say uncertainty materializes in that BAA, let's say the SO BAA, and now we need to use capacity in the BAA to serve the uncertainty. Well, if there is a need for it and the prices will indicate that day-ahead export transfer can be reversed now in EIM. It can become an import transfer. All right.
Yeah.
So it's not like the self-schedule export that it becomes a commitment for the BAA. This is an optimizable construct, the transfer.
Yeah, I'll have to see some more examples. I mean, but what I have in mind is just a stupid hypothetical that there's a whole bunch of virtual bids in the IFM and a whole bunch of transfers clear out, and then RUC hasn't been considered at this stage. Yeah, maybe you got your uncertainty reserves or whatever we're calling them, but you still haven't gone to the RUC process. And then we get into RUC, and you know, we got all the capacity that we need just to serve our own load is necessary in California, and it can't support any of those exports.
Right. That's not stupid. This is a very good, scenario, and one that we had a specific example that we showed last time. In this scenario, RAC will substitute for the virtual supply that clear in IFM, and now that export transfer from the IFM that was supported by virtual supply, to the extent that you can't substitute all the virtual supply and support that export, what will happen is RAC will schedule reliability capacity transfer in the opposite direction. And it will essentially take that back. Optimal. So going to real time, you don't have a problem. So you have a financial position for the day ahead transfer, but the operational transfer going to real time is the RAC one, which is potentially going even in the opposite direction. Right?
Yeah. And George, do you think by us, having Bobby walk through some of the examples he has prepared will kind of help illustrate and walk through these different scenarios, and then we can kind of focus the questions as it pertains to that specific scenario and continue walking through one by one?
Yeah, we can do all of that. Of course, we're here to discuss and even brainstorm on all these topics. We're going to make sure that it's understood to the entire audience here that the market will do the best possible and whatever it can to avoid any kind of situation. If you run into a situation like that, that's what I'm showing here. It's a highly improbable scenario, and at that point, the market did everything it could to help you from that point on its operator actions for emergency conditions.
Gotcha. Thanks, George. Yeah, so I think with some of the questions I've heard thus far, I do think the examples kind of help illustrate those items. So at this point, maybe I'll ask Bobby Olson to raise his hand so we can unmute his line. I'll hold questions until after each example, and then we can dive in as a team. So thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Michelle, for your questions to this point. And at this, let me hand it over to Bobby.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As has been mentioned a couple times now, I'm Bobby Olson with SRP. I've been participating in EDAM and the working groups and everything else for quite some time now, and I've had an opportunity to kind of really think through kind of some of the transfer reliability implications as we start to reach some of the questions that have already been asked when we start talking about limitations of capacity here. Won't profess to be an expert. What we're really trying to do is to facilitate the conversation and make sure that everybody's thinking about the implications and that we're really having a robust dialogue around the many different nuances of the issue. So if we can move to the next slide. I'll put forward some of the caveats and overview of what we're really trying to do. We're trying to set up some examples here. The goal is to try and help illustrate and provoke conversation around the firm transfers, how they might resolve in real time, and how the market ultimately works to resolve and ensure that we're doing exactly what George said, which is keeping the lights on for all of the entities that we can through most scenarios, and when we can't, how does that ultimately play out? This is all intended to be hypothetical, since we do have to work through it. The examples, just to be very clear for everybody here, when we worked through them in the past, there's always questions about cost and who paid what and everything else. These examples are purely constructed with the intent of highlighting reliability of transfers. There are some underlying assumptions regarding economics, but we are not going to go into those. We're really just focused on what are the consequences as we reach those limits. I did set up the examples to really focus on kind of a three balancing area construct that's as complex as we wanted to make these examples. I'll acknowledge right up front that hearing entities in the desert Southwest talking about wheel-throughs can be a hot button issue, and I want to assure everybody that is not our intention here. We're really setting it up to be just kind of representative of what transfers look like between BAs and through BAs. And we are providing no commentary on any of the other wheel-through issues and want to assure everyone that that's really not what we're trying to do. There's other things that I think are really important for people to acknowledge as well, is that when we really work through the examples here, we're talking about when we're at the limits of what the market has already resolved to. We are not going to address or contemplate some of the complexities that everyone will be thinking about. And for those of you outside of the ISO, it's going to include things such as the role of reserve sharing groups and other agreements that are in place to help maintain and support reliability in these exact circles. So with that, if we can move to the next slide. All right, I'd like to provide a little bit of a roadmap. As was mentioned, we have a few different examples we're going to walk through. I've got three that we're going to put out here. The first example is going to be a very basic example to kind of level set for everyone, which really talks about EDAM transfers with real-time loss of generation, and the market has sufficient capacity and can solve for it. That's going to be 99.9% of the issues that we would expect to materialize within kind of an EDAM to EIM construct, and that's the base case for everybody. But recognizing the interest in some of the questions that have already been raised, the real purpose of this is to kind of take that beyond the market has the capacity to solve and look at what insufficient footprint capacity looks like and how that plays through, as well as what happens when we get into one additional complex item, which is these long lead item resources, and having to decommit those resources, because those are areas where many participants will have some concern in how they get through those tight days and what the implications are. So those are the three examples we'll be reviewing. If we can move to the next slide. Now, I want to give everyone a level set. We're going to use the same footprint for each of the three examples. We're going to represent them very elementary, and we're going to presume that there is EDAM participating capacity in each balancing area of 1,000 megawatts. We're going to assume that the way that they're structured and set up is that A and B have interchange capacity, and B and C have interchange capacity, but that area A has no direct interchange capacity with area C. We're really trying to set it up simple. We are not speaking to the interchange limitations or changes to transfer capacities as part of transmission components, because this working group is focused just on the resource efficiency aspect. We do recognize that that will spur some conversation. We don't necessarily want to avoid them, but with the purpose of this working group, it's really focused on just the capacity. There are other complex, these are not intended to be comprehensive examples, but just want to make sure everyone has the basic framework for the footprint. if we can move to the next slide. Each example is going to walk through 3 basic components, kind of a pre-EDAM plan, an EDAM plan, and then a real-time response. So just to give you the same cadence as we work through each, we do want to set the foundation. When it comes to EDAM plan, the pre-EDAM plan, as mentioned previously, each balancing area, A through C, has 1,000 megawatts of available capacity that has been submitted into the RSE. All 3 areas have passed RSE in this particular example. In fact, all the examples we'll cover assumes that all 3 areas have passed and are fully sufficient from the day-ahead time. In this particular example, if we can go back one slide, sorry, to set it up, for EDAM, we have a load and reserve requirement for the balancing area listed on the next line. And as you can see, we varied it a little bit. This is going to be a tight day for area C. And we get a little bit of regional diversity going on as area A has a lower load and requirement relative to C. As you can see on the right-hand side here, there is a summary of the entire capacity and requirements across the footprint. And while it's reasonably tight thanks to area C, there is still sufficient capacity and remaining capacity to kind of absorb some upsets and other changes. So that's pre-EDAM, everybody coming to the table and passing RSE. Next slide, please. Now, as we work through EDAM, we're going to assume that when we talk about EDAM optimized here, we're talking about post-IFM, post-RUC. Here's ultimately the changes that are going on. Trying to keep it very simple in the sense that EDAM awards a transfer from area A through area B to area C. That's helping out with the tight load constrained in area C. And as you can see, while it increases the requirements of area A, it has a neutral effect on area B, and it helps to alleviate some of the concern and stress within area C. There are still the same requirements and capacity for the footprint after EDAM optimizes, and we still have the same amount of resources remaining. One thing that I'd like to note here is when you look at these slides, I recognize that there's numbers. I didn't get so far as to be where George is at. George, I just couldn't find a spot to put the summation symbol in here. Just teasing George a little bit. But when we look at the EDAM transfers here, a plus is intended to represent a increase in commitment for that DA, as it is an export from that area into the next area. We do go ahead and represent the math on both sides. A minus 100 here, as represented in area B, represents the import, offset by the increase of 100 megawatts to represent the wheel-through export. That's how we keep the balancing area neutral. And then going into area C is the import of 100 megawatts at minus 100, which helps to reduce the requirements for the area by 100 megawatts. So just want to be clear on the signs that are on the page. Next slide. So we've had EDAM, everyone comes in sufficient. EDAM optimizes a little bit, and then we get into real time. And as we all know, real time never quite goes how we expect it to. In this particular example, we have a loss of generation, and we are representing a loss of 200 megawatts in the footprint for area A. We want to focus on this because on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that while the capacity of the footprint in real time has dropped from 3,000 megawatts down to 2,800 megawatts, there is still enough capacity across the footprint to support this load. And we can see how this works, where area A increases the available dispatch that it has up by 50 megawatts to use its resources to cover its own load to the extent it can. And then area B and area C also work to respond to support area A. This is exactly how we see EIM work today when we see loss of events and balances, where energy will flow from area B. In this case, it was 70 megawatts, uses the remaining balance there to shift over to area A. Area C flows through 80 megawatts through area B and back to area A. Now, we're just using these numbers as example. It could be a different mix of 70 versus 80 depending upon economics, but I will remind everyone, we did not contemplate economics as part of constructing these examples, just to be referenced. In this case, there is no unserved load. As we indicated, there's still 25 megawatts available. As represented in the example, we've got 25 megawatts remaining, just as we chose to allocate it. It sits within Area C, and Area A and Area B continue to be tight, but load and requirement sufficient through that real-time event. Next slide. Okay, so there are some key takeaways that I think are important for people to recognize here. And George hit a little bit on those earlier, but firm transfers do have implications in real time to both buyers and sellers. So when we talk about implications, I think it's important to recognize that in the example we walked through, we assumed that we had the same capacity available from a day-ahead perspective into the real-time perspective. We also see that the footprint itself is working to take care of the entity that is also exporting on a day-ahead basis to try and ensure that to the greatest extent possible, we are redeploying capacity to support the load requirements of the entire footprint. I'm going to pause there and see if there's any questions, or if Mark wants to maybe facilitate or prompt any questions.
Yeah, no, thank you, Bobby, and thank you for the presentation. Christina, maybe let's go back one slide. And again, kind of going back to what Bobby stated, this is a very high-level example with simple numbers to kind of illustrate the different transfers between day ahead and then real-time market dispatch. Are there any questions as how these megawatts are flowing? Especially coming out of day ahead, how those essentially quote unquote pass through Area B to Area C. So Area B was not impacted from a day ahead load and reserve standpoint based on the EDAM transfer, whereas Area A and C did have a direct impact based on the economic transfer. Do we have any questions for Bobby or the ISO team on this example? All right, I don't see any hands, Bobby, so I believe everyone is okay with the happy path where we have sufficient capacity across the entire footprint.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that, Mark, and I'm sure everybody's really looking forward to this next example where we really get to the question that I think Michelle started to prompt earlier, which is now we reach a concept in which we had a sufficient plan day ahead, and now we're really at the limits, and we're unable to support transfers and real-time load. So let's go back to the setup. I'm going to try and keep this as simple and consistent as we can. We have the same setup where from a pre-EDAM plan perspective, we've got 1,000 megawatts of capacity across the board. Everybody is fully capable and prepared to serve their load for this particular hour. So everyone's presumed to have passed RSE in this particular example. And again, with the footprint summary on the right, you can see that to the same extent that we had before, that we have sufficient capacity to serve the load at this point. So let's go ahead and move forward to see how EDAM optimizes this. We're going to look at the one slide backwards. Yep. We're going to look at the same 100 megawatt transfer. And so it's the 100 megawatt transfers from Area A through Area B over to Area C. You can see everything is set up the same way, where Area A is a little bit tighter in requirements. Area B remains neutral. And Area C really gets the benefit of getting a little bit of breathing room, reducing their requirements from 995 megawatts down to about 100 megawatts. And as you can see from the footprint, we still expect that we have sufficient load. So we go from an EDAM optimized solution into the real time. And let's work through what that real-time loss of generation was. In this particular case, we don't suffer a small loss. We actually suffer a pretty large loss relative to the footprint. We lose 250 megawatts of capacity in this example. And we now recognize from the footprint requirement, the capacity that's available is less than the load and reserves that are required, resulting in a 25 megawatt deficit for the entire footprint. So how does that actually flow across? Well, you still have your EDAM transfers that are firm from area A through area B to area C, but you still have the response from areas B and C trying to support area A. As we saw in the previous example, you see a full response from area B, ramping up its 70 megawatts of available capacity and pushing that over to area A. Area A itself also increases its available capacity by 50 megawatts. That helps to get quite a bit of capacity there. Area C serves a much higher capacity than what they did in the prior example. They serve all 80 megawatts of available capacity. It flows through B back to area A. However, we still wind up with a net deficit within area A of 25 megawatts in this particular example. Both area B and area C wind up flat and tight for the balance of this particular hour. But what you see in this particular example is the real-time environment is how the day-ahead transaction is firm, continues to flow, and you see real-time support of counterflow back to area A to transport this. And I'll pause there because I recognize we are going to have questions here.
No, thank you, Bobby. And I think this is the slide several folks have been waiting for. Let me go to George Angelides. I saw his hand come up from the ISO, see if you wanted to add anything or ask any questions as it pertains to this slide before going to Michelle.
Oh, thank you, Mark. Just an observation that I think it's important here for context. And maybe Bobby was going to say this, so I don't want to trump Bobby if you were going to say this, but the observation that I'm going to make here is in this particular example, the way we say it here, what would happen if we didn't have EDAM and EIM? We should consider that. So if you didn't have the effect of the market, yes, you wouldn't have that 100 megawatt export in the day ahead, but you would also not have the 175 megawatt of input that you're getting in real time. So you would be worse off. The market is actually reducing the deficiency that you would have if you had to stand alone. And that's the observation I wanted to make. Thank you.
George, I absolutely agree. In this particular case, the benefit of the centralized market is it has full intelligence of what capacity is available to deploy. The current construct without that has area B and C have the ability to make discrete decisions about how confident they are in their ability to support in area A. And so I am confident that in the bilateral construct with respect to this, we would still see load shed within area A, or a deficiency, I guess is a better way to characterize it. But I agree that the magnitude of that load shed is likely to be higher. And I would say it's in my perspective, it'd be substantially likely to be higher because everybody is still carrying reserves and a little bit of extra to try and manage through their own risk. This helps to optimize some of that.
All right. Thank you. Let's go to Michelle Keto.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from the CPC. Hey, thank you so much for this example. I think the example that I was teeing up is, let's assume that the EDAM transfer from area A to area B cannot be transferred due to a transmission failure. I'm trying to understand whether area B or area C absorbs that.
That's a good question. So we did not necessarily contemplate or work through the concept of a transmission failure in this particular example. Again, tried to keep it focused just on the resource efficiency component. I do recognize transmission plays a big role in that. In that particular example, it would look like a transfer failure or kind of a generation failure for the responsible BA in that particular case. Unfortunately, we did work through some of those examples, but I don't have one right in front of me in this package.
So I guess I'm confused. So if they can't support, so you're saying that area A, I mean, I guess what you're saying is even though they lost their 250 and normally they would use their 850, they're still going to support the EDAM transfer even despite that failure. But then I'm saying if you use the EDAM failure, because let's say they just decide that they're not going to do that, they're not going to honor it, which I get, is not part of this. You don't know who would absorb it, whether it would be area B or area C.
We haven't worked through that example here. I think when you get into the reality of EDAM, you will have a much more complex footprint and greater interconnections. And what you'll likely see is that network effect where you see transfers redirected in terms of still helping to try and solve for it. There will be transfer limitations to the extent that that sufficiency is supported by firm or highly reliable transmission. Then the exception that I would expect in those particular examples would be for what I believe you might have referenced there, which would be kind of those unknown, unforeseen kind of fire-related or some sort of unexpected loss of firm transmission during the real time.
So let me just put my concern in context. I mean, the CAISO balancing authority always is getting, like 5 to 10,000 megawatts of imports in every hour. And likewise, they're exporting between, maybe 5,000 megawatts, assuming 5,000 of that is RA. So we constantly have a lot of imports coming in and a lot of exports going out. And so I guess it's just really hard to figure out, who's going to have to bear that. And I will note that in the current market, it's my understanding that after HASP, it's California that bears that, right? Because we don't cut the exports, or we seemingly don't cut the exports after HASP. So to the extent that there's any import failure, that's absorbed by California. So my concern is that we're moving this back into the day ahead, and to the extent that there's any import failure, either at the ties or in EDAM space, that it will be California that bears that responsibility. Sort of like if you move EIM and that post-HASP process into the day-ahead time frame and say we're not going to cut exports after the day ahead, well, that's kind of a lot of risk for California load. So that's why I raised that issue.
So that's a fair.
Michelle.
Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, thank you, Bobby. I think what we'll do is, Michelle, we'll take your comment back about, I'll work with the ISO team, and maybe, Bobby, I'll engage you as well on setting up some examples where there is transmission failure and how that may play out. I did see George's hand go up, so I don't know if he wanted to add to Michelle's question prior to me moving on to Tom.
Okay, and then also I wanted to address the issue, just one last thing. What I was saying about the RUC and the imbalance reserve is that the information that was presented to the Market Surveillance Committee basically said that imbalance reserves does not cover the RUC adjustments, and it especially doesn't cover the RUC adjustments during high load days. So 95% doesn't get at the RUC adjustments. And if we move RUC to just be covering the virtuals, we're missing something there. We're missing something big. And I don't know what it is, but maybe you guys have a better sense. That's all. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle. George, did you want to add anything here, or shall I move to Tom?
Just really quick, and I think I have already mentioned it in my presentation and also in response to Michelle, that the day-ahead transfer exports in this case, they're not locked in. In real time, they're re-optimized, and if there is a need, they could be reversed. So the only thing that potentially could be concerned is about these exports of schedules to non-EDAM BAAs, but that we have already addressed with the two scheduling priorities. The LPT exports, we'll cut them if we need to serve loads. So let's keep those two in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
George's
go ahead, Bob.
comment I'm sorry. George's comment is right. We did not, for the purpose of trying to keep this example really simple and really high level, we did not work through some of the re-optimization that there does occur in real time. And we know that we can get into those details, but just really trying to keep this at the concept level. So I agree with George's statement there in terms of optimization.
Thank you. All right, let's go to Tong Wu from WAPA. Tong, you may be muted on your side.
Tong Wu from WAPA. Bobby, thank you for putting these examples together. I wonder, in your example, do you have an assumption that if area A has a generator outage, and then their load needs to be cut? Because if you just run an optimization for A, B, C together in a single optimization without setting some priority policy, I'm not sure necessarily B will have this negative 25 megawatt. Maybe every area has some negative megawatts. So do you have an assumption that there is a priority? If A has a generator outage, it has deficiency, so A needs to bear the consequence.
Yeah, so that's a good question, Tong. I appreciate the question, and I probably should have clarified as part of that. When I set this forward and we worked through the examples, there are a few kind of basic underlying assumptions that are important to understand. And that really gets to what I would say is timeline priority as well, trying to mimic at least what I believe and would represent occurs with respect to transaction priorities today across both the ISO as well as the bilateral markets, in which day-ahead transactions tend to serve at higher priority than real-time transactions. And so this was trying to maintain and honor that higher priority associated with that day-ahead transfer. As you start to see those real-time transfers coming back in more in response at lower priorities, and that's how we're trying to work through it. Consistent with how most entities have represented in discussion, when we talk about making firm sales on a day-ahead basis or on a real-time basis, when we make those firm sales, we've all represented, and I stand by the concept that when we make that sale, we don't cut it for the purpose of saving our own load. In most events, the responsibility of the operator is to ensure that they mitigate risk of loss to the bulk electric system. And it was really structured to avoid cascade consistent with the current practices on firm transports and the priority of the different timeline of transactions.
Thanks, Bobby. So here, it seems to me that the underlying assumption is that area C will serve its load first before giving extra power to B. B would serve its load first before helping A from optimization point of view, not from system emergency point of view. If that's the case, does that mean that there is a reciprocal arrangement or treatment between the ISO BA and the non-ISO BA? ISO has a lower scheduling priority, like George, said that, if resources tight in the ISO area, ISO would serve ISO's load first. So in this example, it seems it's generic that every area would serve its load first before, giving power to a different area.
I think that's an accurate read into it, Tom, as we're assuming that everyone has that same component and obligation. Okay. It also ensures through that process, at least my perspective, and perhaps it's worth commentary on it from others, is we bid in resources from a sufficiency perspective that are reliable enough to support the transfers. And that we understand that if there's a failure of our resource from a reliability perspective, or we have concerns over that we are likely to be the ones that are bearing the consequences of those resource challenges. And I think that ensures that we have confidence as well in terms of the resources that we're working to ensure are participating within EDAM.
Right.
That's my perspective. I think that's probably something good to get some comments on.
Yeah. Thanks, Bobby.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tom. Let's go to Carly Page and then Jeff Nelson.
Hi, my name's Carly Page. I work for the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada, and I really, really appreciate these examples and slides. They're super helpful to help me understand what is actually going to happen. And what I have, I think, is more of a request than a question specific to the slides, and that is that my read of the room is that we are folks who do not enjoy surprises. And I think a lot of the questions that I have and some of the ones that I've heard today are we have a hunger to understand exactly what is going to happen in all possible contingencies. And I hear George when he says that the CAISO is going to be dispatching and optimizing the grid in the most efficient way possible, and I understand that that's what's going to happen. But in practice, seeing this contingency specifically written out has made me realize that I really want to be able to explain to my commissioners, to our stakeholders, if this emergency happens, and this is what's going to happen in the ISO dispatch. If this emergency happens, and this is what's going to happen. And that, I think, is the question that my stakeholders are going to ask me, and thus that I want to be able to answer based on whatever the plan is for CAISO's EDAM. So my request here is, and I hate to give you guys work, is it possible to kind of have similar slides for maybe some of Michelle's examples, or a lot more examples of area ABC, just so that we can all be comfortable of what is going to happen in the event of contingency events?
Yeah, and are you referring to, to the extent there's, loss of generation in footprint A, kind of like what's illustrated here, versus loss of transmission from C to B, things like that?
Correct, yes.
Okay, yeah, and maybe what might help, Bobby, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, you briefly touched on priority. Do you mind clarifying that a little bit on what assumption you put in from a priority level when putting together list examples, and then maybe we'll open that up to the audience to kind of see if that's consistent with others' beliefs, and I'll definitely want to call on the ISO as well.
Sure, happy to do so. When it comes to priority, I look at the way in which I believe that the ISO is currently structured, but also the way in which SRP tends to view priority of transactions. We look at forward long-term transactions as having the highest priority. We then see day-ahead transactions as having a priority that is kind of next highest, so on and so forth into the real-time environment, until you really get down to kind of the EIM type transfers, which have historically been non-firm, non-priority type of transfers that frequently get adjusted in response. So I guess it's really just saying that the further away you go, the further forward in advance of that moment in time of the real-time events, the higher priority the transaction is.
Okay, that's perfect. And Jeff, I see your hand up next, so maybe, as a California entity, do you mind opining on, prior to asking your question, is that in line with how you envision these priorities as well? Adam, if you don't mind unmuting Jeff Nelson's line, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, I don't know. Like today, we don't do that priority with our RUC unless they're priority exports, right? Today, exports from California are, if we don't have the capacity, they're sort of standby. So I don't know how the new EDAM market will work. It may work that way for other people's bilaterals, but our exports are different. I do want to ask some questions. How is this different than sort of bilateral transactions and the EIM today? I mean, is there any difference? And first, Bobby, thank you very much for these examples. Really, really helpful. Really appreciate it. Thank you. If these were just sort of today, and forget about the ISO, where there was just 3 balancing authorities doing these transactions, day ahead, firm schedules, and all 3 balancing authorities are in the EIM. Is there any difference between what would happen today? Then I have another question.
Sure. So I'll go ahead and respond, and if ISO folks need to jump in and kind of comment on the EIM aspect, if I get it wrong, that's fine. So from a day-ahead perspective, that 100 megawatts of kind of that wheel-through firm transfer, that would be expected to resolve. It would remain in place, and I would say in nearly all instances that I've ever seen, that would continue to flow even when there are deficiencies within the BA, within BA Area A, as referenced here. I think George hit on it earlier. From a bilateral construct, there's significantly more discretion that B and C have. I would say most balancing areas will offer support and help, but they're not always obligated to do so. And so there may be instances in which area B and C don't offer enough capacity or offer the same capacity.
Yep, and my hypothetical was A, B, and C are all EIM entities.
Yes.
So it seems like the EIM is kind of doing this today, right?
So the EIM will do some of this within the hour. However, that will have impact on balancing areas for subsequent hours to the extent that it causes them to fail the RSE.
Yeah, well, we shouldn't penalize people that are trying to help, right? So we need to make sure our RSC doesn't penalize people that are helping others. So something to think about.
Yeah, and hold on one second, Jeff, if you don't mind. I saw George's hand fly up, so I want to make sure he didn't want to add to that first question prior to going to your next one. George from the ISO, did you want to chime in?
Yes, thank you, Mark. I do. Jeff, there is a distinct difference here between what we call a day-ahead transfer and a base transfer in EIM. So today, of course, we don't have day-ahead transfers in EIM. We have base transfers, and the base transfers that are declared, they reflect bilateral contracts and arrangements like that, and we do not optimize them in EIM. They could be adjusted in real time, but still, they're adjusted by the participant BAA that submits that information to the market operator, and we adjust them, but not optimally. They're not re-optimized. The day-ahead transfers, which are the result of EDAM here going into EIM, they are still used like the base transfers between EIM BAAs that are not in EDAM as a reference for calculating imbalance energy, all right, and as a reference for settlement for the transfer revenue. And they're still going to be used like the base transfers in the EIM resource efficiency evaluation, okay? So in that way, we don't penalize people for these transfers from the day ahead. We're actually giving them credit for, okay? But when the market will run, there is a very big difference between the base transfers between EIM BAs and day ahead transfers between EDAM BAs and EIM. The day ahead transfers are fully optimizable. The base transfers are not.
Gotcha.
Okay.
That's a big difference. So what really is kind of happening is it's almost like there's not these two colored arrows. That day ahead transfer into A will actually reverse to be a 75 megawatt flow in, as opposed to 100 megawatts out in the real time EIM. So
Yeah, Jeff, you can still counterflow on them, though, right? You can still counterflow on them.
Well,
I mean,
yeah,
the 100 megawatt between B and C could be a base transfer, but then you can have a dynamic transfer in the opposite direction that could be optimally scheduled in EIM to counterflow the base, right? You can still.
Yeah, I jumped in my mind that now A, B, and C are all part of EDAM, and this 100 megawatt is just sort of the EDAM transfer. It's not fixed. It settles at day ahead prices. It gets people set up, but it can be moved to anything in real time, anything feasible.
That's right. That's right.
Okay, so I think that was
one more.
Yeah.
Yeah, one more observation. When it comes to base transfers, we don't have base transfers with the ISO, with the NEIM, because you don't have the concept of bilateral contracts be declared ahead of the market when the ISO is involved. They have to clear the market. So you can have a dynamic transfer from the ISO that clears in IM, but there is no concept for a base transfer that involves the ISO today. So that's just the exception. I wanted to make sure that we have all the moving parts. Okay.
Yeah, and I want to press on sort of the RUC issue really quick. I know RUC's not here, but assume balancing area A is the California ISO, and I'll go back to my other situation where the day-ahead market went and ranged 100 megawatts out, and then you went and RUC'd, and we didn't have the capacity to support that. What I heard you say is there'd be like a RUC counterflow undoing the day-ahead energy flow.
Yeah. So let's say you had 100 megawatt day ahead, let's say IFM transfer
Exactly.
from A to B. All right?
Exactly. Yeah.
You could, right. And let's say that we theorize here. Let's say that this was supported by virtual supply in area A.
Right. Exactly.
Right? All right. So now we run RAC, and RAC doesn't have, let's say, reliability capacity to substitute for this 100 megawatt of virtual supply, but it has that available in area B. So RAC can schedule reliability capacity in area B and counterflow on the 100 megawatt IFM transfer as 100 megawatt reliability capacity transfer in the opposite direction from B to A, and essentially earmark that reliability capacity work from area B, serving or substituting the virtual supply that cleared the IFM in area A. So now you go to real time with essentially 100 megawatt IFM transfer and a counterflow of 100 megawatt reliability capacity transfer. You're basically set up to essentially use whatever physical supply scheduled the day ahead just for meeting your load in area A, because you don't have to serve that 100 megawatt IFM transfer, right? Because
right. So yeah, in that case, that the transfer would go to 0 from A to B in real time, and the generation in B would crank up 100 megawatts, assuming everything else was perfect.
Well, yeah, but again, this is all going to be subject to the real-time optimization. There may be more optimal scenarios to, so that's one scenario. Yeah.
And maybe, George, I don't mean to put you on the spot, kind of going back to Carly's request, and I think it would be beneficial for everybody. Maybe that the ISO comes prepared this coming Monday with a few more examples that illustrate what you and Jeff just talked about.
And just, I don't really want to ask this. It's sort of kind of a yes or no question. So if we're all in the entire EDAM now, so we don't have any transfers that are self-scheduled to non-EDAM participants, there is no more concept of a priority export under this framework. No such thing as a priority EDAM export from California.
You're correct.
In
the
this
only
framework.
concept for priority exports are with the non-EDAM BAAs.
Non-EDAM. Okay, in this framework. Okay, I'll think about that. George, thank you. That's it.
All right. Thank you, George. Thank you, Jeff. I saw Paul Wood with his hand up from Pacific Corp. Paul, did you mean to take your hand down before I move to Kevin Smith? I will assume the hand was meant to be lowered. All right, let's go to Kevin Smith with Bank.
Okay, thank you, Kevin Smith, Bank. Can you hear me? I don't see any mic on.
Yep.
Okay.
Nope, I hear you well.
Okay, thank you. So actually, Jeff just asked the golden question, literally. What I'm trying to understand is today, and this is kind of a George question. I hope I can articulate this, so forgive me. But so today we buy capacity, non-RA capacity, and that is gives us a priority export day ahead, but it also gives us priority in real time if there's any adjustments. It's a curtailment priority that we get. And so we're treated on par with internal demand. So I guess the big question is, what is the PT export to an EDAM entity? So tomorrow, Bank, we're in EDAM. For RSE, if we're buying capacity to support our resource sufficiency and our internal RA needs, we would buy capacity in the CAISO. We'd be paying for that non-RA capacity for that prioritization. But once the EDAM optimization completes itself, I am no different than anybody else as far as priority going into real time, or do I, because you mentioned, George, that you'd still would be, in response to Michelle, you still would be potentially re-optimizing in real time. So do I retain a priority, or am I just all exports from the close of that day ahead forward are all treated equally going into real time? Does that make sense?
Yes. So you're referring to a contractual arrangement where there is a non-RA resource in the SOBAA that provides energy to serve SMUD load, correct?
Correct. Can you hear me? I don't. Yeah, and
today it is scheduled as a PT export from the ISO BAA to SMUD, correct?
Correct.
All right. So now we move forward in the future where SMUD is an EDAM BAA. All right. So you don't have anymore this PT export. Now you have in place a transfer. And for RSC purposes, this is a bucket one transfer. So we will provide the ability to have the scheduling coordinator, in this case, I don't know, maybe the SMUD entity or some scheduling coordinator, to define a bucket one transfer, all right, for an export from the ISO into SMUD supported by non-RA capacity, all right? Now, just by this construct alone, you get the benefit in the resource sufficiency evaluation from the bucket one transfer. So this is number one. Now, number two, you have the option to leave that transfer to be optimized like any other transfer, in which case you have an optimal solution to solve your load, which could be from that resource in the ISO, or maybe a cheaper alternative, okay? Or if this is registered as a transmission contract, okay, then for transmission contracts specifically, this is the exception to optimize transfers. For transmission contracts specifically, the owner of the contract has the ability to exercise the contract by self-scheduling on that transfer. And this is the example that we presented, I think it was last time, where we showed that the scheduling coordinator that is associated with this bucket one transfer can actually self-schedule the transfer. And this is the only case where that transfer is not going to be re-optimized. It's locked in because now it's self-scheduled. But this is the only case. It's associated with the exercise of a transmission contract. Every other case, the transfer is optimizable.
Yeah, so, well, sort of. I mean, I think that second piece, you were getting at it in the first piece. The second piece, you know, we are paying for capacity. There's no associated transmission or anything with that. So all we are doing, and I'll say bank because it's not just SMUD, there's other entities that own resources in the CAISO that use them as supporting resources. So other members of banks such as Modesto have resources in the CAISO. And today, and it's non-RA, so it's not committed. And so today we, you know, that's how we self-schedule in amount equal and opposite to the amount that's being offered into the market as non-RA, and it can be dispatch or the CAISO may not take it, but in any case, the option's there, and we have, in effect, a net zero impact on the CAISO by way of export. And so that's how that generally works. I guess the crux of my question is we still would be purchasing non-RA capacity to gain that value for the resource sufficiency purpose, bucket one. No associated transmission, but we're calling this resource matched up with our self-schedule. This is our right to that export. So that's bucket one. But then once the market runs, is all dispatch, all re-optimized schedules, are they all served equally? And therefore, there is no hierarchy at that point. We're all, in effect, treated as internal demand under some, you know, penalty factor or whatever, however the ISO would do curtailment priority if we got into a supply constraint. You know, there could be uneconomic adjustments made, but in any case, I'm just trying to understand what happens after day ahead with that resource. It doesn't roll over and give me additional priority into real time. We're all at that point, everybody, whether you had a supporting resource or the CAISO or not, and you're served now by a CAISO resource and your APS or SRP, you're getting an export, that is going to have equal priority with the export to bank that had a supporting resource.
You mean economic priority?
Yeah.
Because if you don't self-schedule it, then essentially you get all the EDAM benefit that we were discussing about earlier, which is you get to count that bucket one transfer in the resource efficiency evaluation, but then when the market runs, you get the full benefit of economic displacement.
Yeah. Okay. I don't want to keep beating this because I think that answer, you answered my question, and if I have additional ones, I'll tee them up later. But thanks, George.
No, thank you, Kevin, and thank you, George, for weighing in there. And Bobby, you know, I kind of want to circle back to your priority answer that I had kind of posed. If I heard you correctly, it sounded like, you know, you have from a priority standpoint, you got the forward long-term contracts, then you have what materializes in day ahead, and then what materializes in real time. And the conversation I just heard kind of spurred this question where I equated this long-term contract with kind of that resource-specific export. And if I heard you correctly, that would still flow. Therefore, you wouldn't cut that prior to cutting your own native load. Am I following that correctly?
Yes, I think that in general, that's the way in which SRP works to prioritize. In the event that curtailments were required, that would be how we would execute on those curtailments. And that's our understanding as to how most other OATs are written with respect to curtailments of exports as well.
Okay, so from a priority standpoint, those forward long-term contracts have the utmost priority, and then you start moving down the list that I just threw out there.
Yes.
Okay. Now, I want to hear from the audience, is that what everyone, where do you guys stand on that priority order? I saw Stuart Kelly with his hand up earlier from LA. I don't know if you meant to lower your hand or not, Stuart.
Hey, Mark, you're just heading on exactly the question I was going to ask. I just wanted to make sure there was what that curtailment priority looked like, and is there consistency or potentially issues. So that's something I'd love to try and tease out. And Bobby, thanks again for the presentation. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, so Stuart, before I let you go, I'm not going to let you off the hook that easy. Do you mind opining on what your thoughts are with that order?
No, I need to do further research with Ellie and just double check that one, Mark. So
okay.
It'd be good to kind of pull that information and collate it just to make sure there's consistency.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Is there anyone else out there? I believe the Southwest entities are in line with what Bobby just stated. Are there any others out there that would like to raise their hand and be willing to chime in on this priority order? I think that's kind of the crux of this issue here, and it's definitely an important element that, if we can, let's tackle in this working group. Paul Wood from Pacificor, thank you for raising your hand. Let's go to Paul Wood.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Paul Wood, Pacificor. And I appreciate, Bobby, you putting these slides together, and these examples are really helpful. I was just going to agree, I think, in principle as to how, Bobby described the priority list. I think Pacificor would agree with how that's been, how Bobby presented that.
Thank you. I appreciate your willingness to chime in there. Do I have any representation from Portland or Idaho on the line that would be willing to chime in here? All right, I don't see any. And then, Jeff, did you mean to keep your hand up?
Yeah, I did, but it wasn't for this question. It was related. So if anyone can address this, they should jump in front of me, then come back to me.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other hands, so why don't you take it away, Jeff? Go ahead.
Okay, so great example. So let's just say that this has actually happened, and now Area A is 25 megawatts bad. They're all separate balancing authorities, so it's Area A's duty to keep its own lights on, right? So nothing in the EDAM design has B or C dipping into reserves, or at least on a first action. Area A has got the responsibility, and they're probably going to have to dip into their reserves and call in any sort of emergency assistance or whatever they can, because the market's done. The market can't do anything else to help. Do I understand that? And then I have one more question.
So, Jeff, that's consistent with how I structured the example. It's consistent with SRP's understanding, and I'm really glad the way you kind of characterized that, is that when we are looking at the deficiency here, it's not immediately, I think I referenced load shed earlier, and I should have been more cautious with my words. We really are talking about what is most likely a reserve deficiency in this particular case, and that balancing area will then be working to cure that reserve deficiency through other tools that have not been included as part of this, which might be reserve sharing groups and others.
Okay, and so now I'm going to say, okay, let's pretend Area A is a Cal ISO, and those 100 megawatts are backed by resource adequacy. What I'm hearing the ISO's proposal is they make no recognition of resource adequacy units in these transactions. the resource adequacy has no more commitment to California or priority to California under this framework. And if the Area A was the ISO, they might have to curtail 25 megawatts of load while exporting 100 megawatts from RA resources. Do I understand the framework?
Jeff, I beg to differ. This is George.
Okay, go for it,
you
George.
You're getting back 175, right? So you're actually getting more than what you let out. So, and the resource adequacy requirement is to bid in the market, and they did. So, and okay, we have a day-ahead transfer out for
resource adequacy is more than just a bid. California has secured capacity to keep the lights on in California, right? So I think we need to think about the property right that's associated with resource adequacy in the design. But I do see your point that they're getting back 175.
Right.
But I think you really need to think more of the property right of resource adequacy, not the must-offer requirement of resource adequacy.
I understood. I was just speaking from a market perspective. Yes, yeah, that's
sure. Yeah, George, quick
question,
and maybe this kind of adds on to Jeff's scenario. So, you highlighted that, hey, Area A is importing 175 while 100 megawatts was getting exported, so they're still net importing 75. If Area A did not export that 100 megawatts and we lost, 250 megawatts of available capacity, I guess I'm struggling to see, my understanding at least is California is overall a net importer, right? And I guess I'd be interested to see, and I'd have to go back and look at, what it looked like in some of the tight system conditions. I hear Jeff's point that, hey, this RA capacity was paid for California load, but, if we look at the 175 megawatts moving from Area B to A, does that mean Areas B's 175 megawatts that was not paid for or reserved in some type of forward procurement process for Area B?
Not necessarily. You would have potentially bids in Area B that represent capacity that was not scheduled in the day-ahead market, or it's coming out of the dispatch of reliability capacity and imbalance reserve awards that they were procured in Area B. So you could have any mix of those.
Okay.
In the latter case, there is already an availability capacity payment that was paid in the day ahead, and there is an energy payment at the marginal LMP. And in the former case, that you have new capacity that is made available in real time, well, it's dispatched and it's paid for. It's paid its energy, right? So no one loses here.
All right. Do we have any other questions on the point Jeff raised? Any other questions for Bobby before we move on to example number 3? I see Jeff Spires with his hand up from PowerX. Go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Mark. Jeff Spires with PowerX. I had a different comment to follow up on some of the discussion earlier in the call. First of all, Bobby, thanks very much for putting these together. As others have said, I think it's super helpful to just have some numbers and think through what some of the implications might be. And I think it highlights that these are complicated issues. My feedback is that, I think these examples that you put together, Bobby, start with an underlying assumption that all the BAs have met their resource sufficiency requirements. They've done what they need to do day ahead, and there's some kind of real-time event like a unit outage or something that leaves the footprint short, and what do you do about that? But I think, one thing that we should also be thinking about is making sure that the market design both from a resource sufficiency perspective and just how the market creates the solution, doesn't create the shortfall. It's one thing, I mean, obviously we're going to have real-time events that occur that have to be dealt with, but I think it's another matter to have shortfalls that result from the design of the market. And the issue in particular I'm raising is the discussion earlier about physical exports being enabled through the EDAM that are supported by virtual supply, and then having to hope that the RUC can find a solution to resolve that by committing resources in the footprint somewhere to make up for that afterwards. I don't think that that's a good solution. I think that just at a conceptual level, commitments that are made through the EDAM from any BA should be consistent with the physical capability they have. I don't think any BA wants to get a day-ahead market solution that leaves them short, and I don't think any BA wants to be receiving an import from their neighbor that's supported by a virtual. And so I think that the design needs to start from the assumption that the day-ahead IFM solution is feasible, and that there needs to be some mechanism to ensure that those commitments that are being made through the market solution are starting from the, before there's any real-time outages or anything like that, at least we're starting from the place that those transfers are supported by physical capacity. So I just think that that's an important element when we're thinking this through, and just wanted to provide that feedback.
Thank you, Jeff. George or Danny, anyone else from the ISO want to chime in there? IFM results being not feasible and where RUC comes in?
Yeah, Mark, I think to respond to Jeff, we shouldn't see the day-ahead market as only the IFM piece. The day-ahead market has IFM followed by RUC. We should see the result of both these functions and what happens at the end of RUC. So IFM is, provides an opportunity to participants to take a financial position, and RUC firms it up in terms of physical capacity. So I think the design here behaves exactly as we wanted to have. We have the ability, virtual bits, to clear in the IFM, and maybe because of that, you have export transfers, which will then, RUC will firm them up in terms of physical capacity. And as we said before, you can have reliability capacity transfers in the opposite direction if that is required. So I think we should see both of them working in together, not in pieces.
Thank you, George. All right, let's go to Kathleen Colbert from Vistra.
Hi, yeah, thanks, Mark. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Appreciate the examples. I think appreciate the conversation. If you're going to iterate on these examples, and I think some stakeholders have asked for different versions, I would recommend adding at least in one area the scenario of intertie transactions. I understand that it's an open question for non-CAISO areas, whether EDAM would do that, but do not have an anticipation it changes for the CAISO's intertie transactions, and at least in EIM today. So embedded EIM today translated to EDAM. So in that mind, I think Jeff suggested to think of area A as CAISO. If you could update the scenarios for area A to include intertie point and some imports and potentially exports, I think that would really add some additional value to this scenario. So one of the things that's missing, I think, with context from what may not change is that if, under California's RA rules, import RA is required within CAISO, subject to CPC jurisdiction, to self-schedule. And so when I'm thinking about how the market would function with transfers, kind of creating a trade-off between transfers versus imports, I do think about the economics. I know it's not in the scenario, so I am recommending this as an enhancement, but the economics of a self-scheduled import that is competing for that transfer capability is probably going to displace at least an economic transfer. There may be self-scheduled transfers, it may not. But like I said, it is more complex, but it's also realistic under the assumption that RA buyers, so LSEs within California, will continue to sign and execute RA contracts with that kind of obligation that may not be within EDAM and may be coming from other areas outside of EDAM. And that functionality will need to be supported. So if it could be enhanced to capture that reality or expected reality, I think that would add value, because it's possible there could be a 50 megawatt import transaction self-scheduled at that intertie that would have provided and made the area A sufficient. So I just think we need to build on it. Thanks.
No, thank you, Kathleen. I made a note of that, and we'll take that suggestion back to the team that's going to put together some examples. I appreciate that. Let me go to Petter. You there, Petter? It's hard to hear you. Petter, I think you're having audio difficulties. It looks like maybe your headset is having issues. All right, maybe we'll come back to Petter if time allows. If not, Petter, I made a note here. I saw Kevin Smith in the queue as well. Let's go to Michelle Keto, and then I'm going to turn it back to Bobby. Maybe we'll hold off on example 3, Bobby, based on time, and give individuals time to think about it over the weekend, and then Monday come fresh, ready to kind of dive into example 3, as well as a few other examples that have been requested and laid out here to help spur conversation. Michelle?
Yeah, so this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. I do have one question about whether there's sort of an asymmetry in risk. So let's assume that most other BAAs are vertically integrated, or at least the BAA in some way has control over the resources. So let's say that they have more resources than load, but they only bid in the amount that they need to. So into the day-ahead market, let's say in this example, their day-ahead and load reserve requirement is 930, so like area B or area A, whichever one, they only bid in what to cover their load, and then they reserve the additional capacity in case there's an issue. And then they, like let's say they think, well, I might have some forced outages, so area A only bid in 850, and then they reserve the additional 150. So going into real time, they have some flexibility with regard to the resources that they have available. Now, I just wonder, the CAISO is different. The CAISO doesn't hold back any resources. And so is CAISO going to be further on the margin than every other balancing authority because, like let's say their load is 40,000 and they have 45,000 megawatts of resources and they bid those all in, and those get taken as EDAM transfers because the other balancing authorities only bid in what they need to cover their load. So I'm concerned about this asymmetry in transfers going into the real time and the potential effects that has on reliability. Have you guys thought through that?
I see Danny Johnson with his hand up. Danny?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So, Michelle, we have thought about that. I think all BAAs would be open to participate in the EDAM, how their BAA best determines they should participate in the EDAM. Regarding the CAISO in particular in this example, I don't think there's a day-ahead bid requirement for renewable energy, which does make a sizable portion of the RA portfolio. So I'm not sure that all 45,000 would be bid in. There's also some nuances on how RDRR would be considered for the day, in the day ahead. So I think to the extent that you'd be looking for the CAISO to have residual supply that might be available into the real time, we may have implicitly already have that through the existing rules, to the extent that I think the PUC would want more supply available in the real time. Different participation methods in the EDAM might need to be considered.
Okay, and then so let me just get those two. You said that renewables do not have a day-ahead obligation, and so does that make us RSE short?
I think it depends. I think this is something that the CAISO as a BAA and how we would engage in EDAM is something that the CAISO will have to figure out.
Okay, and then RDRR, can you tell me specifically, are you saying that the RDRR does not have a day-ahead obligation, and would that make us RSE short as well?
I believe it can bid in, and don't quote me on this, but I believe it can bid into the day ahead, and it has the optionality to do that. I don't think there's a must offer for it in day ahead. And then in real time, it can't be bid in until it would be enabled by the operators during a system emergency.
Oh, so are you telling me that RDRR is not included in the RC?
Well, right now, do you have a must offer obligation for it in the day ahead time frame?
No. Now I'm talking about
that there isn't one. Well, the EIM RSC?
Yes. Yeah.
To the extent that it's enabled, yeah. To the extent that it's not enabled, there aren't bids there to consider. Right?
Okay,
the bids
and
have
it's
to
only
be able to be released into the market through summer.
Okay, and let me just confirm that it's only enabled in an EEH. Is that right?
I think that's the current translation that the ISO is working through from our non-EEA energy emergency paradigm.
Okay, so we could. Okay, so this is a separate issue that I'll take up with you guys.
This is a separate issue that I think we've actually discussed in the EIM RSC or WEAM RSC venue. I think we've actually had a couple of workshops kind of detailing this exact point.
Yeah, I agree, but I just feel like people have answered this in different ways. I feel like I was literally on a call where we were told that the RDR was included, so that's why I'm very confused.
Yeah, we could take that offline, Michelle. Did you have a question as it pertains to this example or today's conversation?
Yeah.
And then I'll move this on.
Yeah. No. Okay. So you're saying that, but I am still concerned that these issues aside, we're still going to be bidding on pretty much everything we have, unless you're saying that CAISO is going to develop a different process for holding some back. But I don't. Is that a process that I'm not aware of that process?
I think just from a pure efficiency standpoint, to the extent that we can have a design that encourages all entities to fully participate in the EDAM, that's what we would strive to do.
Right. But do you guys have any thought about this sort of reliability asymmetry? Because other balancing authorities don't do that and won't be required to do that.
I think if we create the right incentives about how the EDAM transfers into the EIM, maybe we could create that incentive for them to do that. And then to the extent that we can't, yeah, this is something that the CAISO BAA does need to examine on how it would participate in the EDAM.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Danny, for jumping in there. Let's try Tether one more time before passing it to Bob Cott.
Mark, can you hear me now?
Yep, I hear you loud and clear, sir. Go ahead.
So George, when we define the reserve requirements for each EDAM BAA, they are related to their load, and plus some other biggest contingency and whatever. If in EDAM we have some exporters, would it be necessary to further firm resources by dynamically adjusting their reserves based on increase of their effective load because of exports in EDAM?
Hi, Peter, this is George. So if we're talking about base transfers that are not optimizable, these are very firm, and they become the...
No, I'm talking about economic transfers. If we do economic transfers, and those people supporting economic transfer, obviously their load plus economic transfers is a larger quantity than what originally is used to calculate how much reserves they need to carry.
Yes, that's true if they're not changing, right? If they're optimized and they're changing potentially every 5 minutes, practically you wouldn't be able to adjust your ancillary services target, your contingency reserve target every 5 minutes, right? So
No, I'm not talking about every 5 minutes. I'm talking about in EDAM, on the hourly basis, you can dynamically adjust reserve requirements based on amount of export that is going out of EDAM BAA.
Potentially, yes, but I fail to see the need for that, because what we're saying here is that these transfers are optimizable in real time. So if the economics are in place to even reverse them, that will actually happen. So I think if every BAA
it's more about carrying reserves. If they have outage in source BAA, they need to carry more reserves to support both internal load and export. It's kind of having higher confidence in export because they will be supported by increased reserves in BA that is sourcing those exports.
Yeah, we have not discussed it in this work group, Peter, and as you know, we don't have in the scope for initial EDAM implementation and ancillary service optimization across the grid. We intend to realize the fact that its EDAM BAA will actually self-provide their needs for contingency reserves. So that may be a good point to discuss at a later phase when we will expand the scope to include an ancillary service co-optimization in EDAM. I think at this point it's probably premature. Don't you think?
Well, it was discussed in the past when we were comparing how people are firming in bilateral and node trades. They pretty much have to guarantee that those exports will be supported in the case of contingency, not to be curtailed because they don't carry contingency for that. And I understand that you're not running co-optimization except in RSC, but you have still requirements for reserves. You don't have bids, but you have to maintain the reserves even in IFM for EDAM BAAs who are not co-optimizing, right?
We did discuss it in EIM. The issue in EIM was that through the various intervals, those export transfers could be building up, but then you could not recall them or reoptimize them all in the opposite direction because there's still ramp constraints that limit the resources that provide that energy. So you could ramp up your exports over a period of an hour, and then you have a contingency, and you want to get it all back, but it's not possible because of ramp constraints, right? So in this discussion,
I think it's more complex. It's more complex than we have time. Yeah. So just a quick follow-up on what Jeff Spire said. No matter what you do, integrate IFM rack or separate rack capacity is satisfied in both cases. So there is no kind of concern that because you have rack separate that you're going to be resource insufficient.
Yeah, we definitely have to have more discussion on this particular issue.
All right, we are at time, so I'm going to hop in here. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. Bobby, great job on putting together these examples, and we had a lot of questions and robust discussions around each one of those, which is exactly what we hoped this would cause. So thank you in advance. Team, let's all work with the ISO team on putting forth a few more examples. We'll do our best to get those posted in advance of the call. Let's think about some of these concepts and ideas, honing in on priority and things like that, and then let's get back to it on Monday. So thank you for your time today. Have a great rest of your afternoon, and we'll chat soon.